Okay, while I'm here, let's just do, everybody was up in their, out of their seats, so let's just do it some more. Everybody who feels up to it and is willing, stand, throw your hands in the air, and say, let's have a shout out for salmon. Salmon! All right, and while we're at it, let's do a shout out for sandlance. Sandlance! And how about surf smelt? Surf smelt! All right. Okay, well, we're still working here. So you probably have not thought a lot about sandlance or surf smelt, but I'm hoping by the end of my presentation you'll care about them deeply. The orcas, the southern residents want you to, because they are part of the complex ecosystem that is the nearshore habitat. And I am here representing Sound Action. We are a tenacious regulatory watchdog group in the Puget Sound Salish Sea, and I'm hoping to provide you some thought that there are things we all can do that can make a difference. Because we heard some very sad stories today. Not that I can make those go away, but so my name is Suzanne Major. I'm a board member of Sound Action, and I'm here to speak, and I'm very honored to be here to speak at Superpod to talk to you about the accomplishments of Sound Action here in the Puget Sound and Salish Sea area. The nearshore is a habitat that's needed for Chinook salmon, as you've heard. Can you still?
Bring it closer to your mouth, please.
Okay. So that the nearshore is a habitat needed for Chinook salmon to thrive so they can grow up to be eaten by the southern residents. And our beloved and iconic southern resident orcas rely on a healthy Salish sea. Puget Sound may be breathtakingly beautiful, but looks can be deceiving. Below the waterline, our beloved Salish Sea is on the brink of collapse. This critical ecosystem has suffered significant losses. Eelgrass and kelp beds are an important part of the nearshore habitat, and in many areas, eelgrass beds have completely disappeared. Herring populations have dropped 40% since 1970. One area in South Puget Sound called Cherry Point had the largest herring stock in all of the Sound, and the Cherry Point stock has declined there by 90% with no signs of recovery. And herring, along with sandlance and surf smelt, are a critical food source for salmon, including Chinook. So Chinook, or king salmon as it's called in the grocery store and restaurants, as you know, here in the room, those listening on their screens may not, know that that's a mainstay food for southern resident orcas. And as you all know, and others may not, the southern resident orcas eat only fish. They do not eat marine mammals. The Chinook, or king, are now at a mere 10% of their historic population levels. Experts report that the primary threat to the recovery of Puget Sound and the Salish Sea is the continued loss of habitat. Those of you who heard Ken Balcom speak earlier, that was one of the important H's. In Washington State, the primary law governing nearshore habitat protection is called, strangely enough, the Hydraulic Code. And all in-water development work requires what's called an HPA permit, which is under the jurisdiction of the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. The law mandates a project must protect fish life and not result in habitat loss in order to be approved. However, the Department of Fish and Wildlife fails to meet this mandate and approves virtually every permit, regardless of scale or impact. Issued permits are also commonly missing critical environmental elements, and Northwest Treaty Tribes, environmental groups, and even state agency staff have all documented concerns that the failed administration of this permit program is causing significant habitat loss and species impact. Since 2014, this is a graphic that demonstrates that there have been approximately 2,500 nearshore development permits issued by the state of Washington. It's a death by 2,500 cuts. No permits were denied. If we are to save Puget Sound, the salmon, the southern resident killer whales, there's no more time for empty words. It's time for bold, effective sound action, turning the tide for Puget Sound and the Salish Sea. Sound Action, as I mentioned, is a tenacious regulatory watchdog group. We review every Puget Sound and Salish Sea HPA permit issued by the state. If a permit allows habitat loss or violates the law, we take legal action. Since 2014, Sound Action has reviewed more than 2,500 permits and filed more than 150 appeals. And these appeals have made a difference. For those of you who came by ferry and didn't fly in on your private planes or came in by yacht, you came through likely the Anacortes Marina. They had applied for a large-scale pile driving project, and it was in a herring spawning habitat. Pile driving can kill fish and destroy recently spawned eggs. But the Department of Fish and Wildlife issued a permit with no timing provision. Sound Action appealed, and a protective timing provision was added to the permit. Doe Island is another example of one of our successes. Doe Island is just off of Orcas. It's a tiny little island, and there was an applicant. This law applies to private applicants as well as government agencies and others. There's an applicant who had applied for a pier ramp and float, and kelp and eelgrass had been documented as being present at the site, and regulations require a spring-summer survey of underwater vegetation with applications for all overwater structures. And new and expanded structures are not allowed to be placed within 25 feet of kelp or eelgrass. And I draw your attention to the red arrow. I don't see any structure. I see water. But the Department of Fish and Wildlife claimed that there was an existing structure, and this was simply a replacement, and therefore issued the permit without the required vegetation survey and allowed a new float structure over and adjacent to critical kelp and eelgrass. Sound Action appealed, and the permit was overturned. Yay, I like the yays. We don't have enough of those these days. Sound Action also does a lot of policy work as a tool for habitat preservation. Here are cute little sand lance and surf smelt that you were rooting for before. And our policy advocacy is quite effective to improve state policies and policy implementation that result in habitat and species protection. For example, sand lance and surf smelt are little forage fish species that are a primary producer in the food chain. They are critical in salmon prey. They spawn high on the beach. And the regulations that are on the books provide them special protections for timing of projects and project impacts. But the state has something they call a forage fish spawning habitat occupancy standard. This is a distance along the shoreline where when eggs are found, that is supposed to capture and protect the spawning area. The state historically used an arbitrary 500-foot measurement and would not consider forage forage fish habitat protections for anything outside this tiny area. There were very few historic surveys of forage fish spawning areas, and this combination resulted in science information and habitat and regulatory gaps. So here's an aerial image of that gap. It shows a proposed bulkhead project in Puget Sound, that's the red, and the blue is the documented forage fish spawning area next to it. Even when located a few feet from documented habitat, the state refused to protect the forage fish spawning area. So what do you think? Sound Action took action and filed countless appeals on this issue because little fish plus big fish equal orca. The occupancy standard policy change was made as a result, a direct result of our appeals. More than 500 new miles of shoreline got immediate protection, and Sound Action then also worked to secure funding from the state legislature for the state to undertake extensive new forage fish survey work to better inform the science behind the department's permitting decisions. And these next two slides show one example of that success, how we've effectively moved the dial for salmon and orca recovery. This is a bay in South Puget Sound, Willachit Bay. The blue shows the forage fish spawning habitat that had been documented in 2015. There wasn't much. But after our appeals and the policy was changed and the habitat standard was changed and the updated surveys that we got support for funding for, the entire shoreline now requires habitat protection. And that's a huge difference. Orcas need salmon, salmon need forage fish, and they all need an intact and healthy ecosystem. This is something that Sound Action has stepped up to tirelessly defend and protect. This is Sound Action's story of identifying gaps in the enforcement of laws that are on the books and also our unrelenting dedication to our mission. Sound Action takes the battle for the near shore to the front lines, where it is won or lost with every permit that's issued. We one that we just finished a 2-day trial related to a permit that was issued on the western side of San Juan Island. This permit was issued to grant more than 40 extra feet of a float without following the law and without justification. We're waiting for that decision. We are tenacious and we're making a difference because vision plus action equals change. We will continue to fight for orca habitat. We will review every permit, take legal action, work to strengthen the science, and use our voice to promote habitat preservation as part of the prey availability work group of the governor's task force for southern residents recovery. You heard about that a little bit earlier. And for the forage fish, the salmon and the orcas that call the Salish Sea their home, please step up and join us as we work to turn the tide for Puget Sound. I urge you to join our email list and like us on Facebook. And thank you very much, and thank you, Kim and Sarah.